All right, welcome back to another Q&A. We have a question about the Sabbath and how it is understood in early Christianity. The question itself is, I am puzzled why Orthodox Christians don't take the Sabbath seriously, and when did this shift happen? Well, I would say that the question itself is a little problematic. And so I'm going to provide a perspective from the Orthodox Christian tradition of Antioch, at least. So the Sabbath comes to us from the Pentateuch in two places, in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, and reads as follows. We'll go with the Exodus first. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is therein, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And from Deuteronomy, something very similar, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your manservant or your maidservant or your ox or your ass or any of your cattle or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out thence with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So in the Exodus version, we have the giving of the Sabbath, and in the Deuteronomy version, we have the speech of Moses telling the Israelites how to observe it, to keep it, and what to do and why. And so it occurs after the Exodus event. Well, in the New Testament, we have a couple issues that are brought to our attention with regard to the Sabbath. Two of them, really. One has to do with work rest, and the other has to do with the consecration of the day. So with regard to work and rest, this is something that was spoken to slaves, that none would be a slave. If you have a day of rest, that means you have an entitled day not to work. You have a day where you're entitled not to be enslaved. We also see that in Mark 2 that Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. What does that mean, to be the Lord of the Sabbath? Well, I mean, it's pretty clear, at least from that passage, that Christ is doing a healing activity on the Sabbath day. And so being Lord of the Sabbath means he's the number one, he is the Lord. At least that's how it's conveyed in the New Testament. And that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? And so that's the general New Testament teaching. And we see other teachings about this, in New Testament literature, such as the book of Hebrews, where it's, accounted for as rest. And that's really, I think, the key point. It was a consecrated day, a day for rest from work, right? You tie it all together, and that's what it is, but it's leading to something. And the Eastern Christians, or the early Christians, have a specific view on what this specifically is ontologically in history. And so it might help us if we understand what the word actually means. It's not just a Hebrew word. It's a word meaning the end of a period of time. And usually that would be like a 2-week period, a month period, whatever. In Akkadian, which is the language of the ancient Assyrians and Babylonians, it's Shabbatu. So it's, at the end of a series of weeks, let's say, would be the Shabbatu. It would be the period where, it's come to a close. And we see it in Aramaic also, and in Hebrew as the final day of the week. Just for our reference here, if we're looking at the Hebrew days of the week, we see them all numbered, right? For those of you who are reading along in Hebrew, Sunday is Yom Echad, day 1, Monday, Yom Sheni, day 2, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i, Yom Chemishi, Yom Shishi, and then finally Shabbat, which is the Sabbath. In Aramaic, hadib shabo, trainib shabo, thlothib shabo, arbab shabo, hamshab shabo. So they go 1 to 5, one day, or day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, arubto for Friday, and then shabto for Saturday. So shabto, Shabbat, Sabbath, it's all the same word. That's the conclusion of a week-long period. Now, the question we should ask is there a seventh day? And if so, what is the seventh day, right? So I'm not asking about a Sabbath, because according to our calendars, the Sabbath on our calendar is the seventh day. But when does a calendar start, right? Like, a calendar has to start at a certain point in time. Someone has to declare what day it is. And so if in another part of the world, they're using a different calendar where the seventh day might be on our third day, let's say, that would be the seventh. Thus, that would be the conclusion of the week on a 7 calendar week system, right? So all that to say is it's really dependent on the calendar. Now, St. Isaac of Nineveh indicates for us that 6 days are accomplished in the service of life. The 7th is accomplished in the grave, and the 8th in departing from it, meaning departing from the grave. He continues and says, as those who are worthy receive in this world the mysteries of Sunday in a symbol. In other words, what we get from the calendar is effectively teaching us about life, death, and the general resurrection in the future. So for Christians actually don't see the week just as a series of 7 days. There's this concept of the 8th day. Well, what's an 8th day? In the early periods, Christians would gather together on the 8th day, meaning they would gather after the 7th, after the Sabbath. So why not just say Sunday? Some do. Some speak of it as Sunday, but the general consensus is they're not talking about just a calendar day Sunday. They're talking about the 8th day because it is a new day, the same way that Christ is a new Adam, right? A new human, right? So in the new human, there is this concept of resurrection, this idea of transformation of death. And the 7th day, the Sabbath day, is that rest. And as St. Isaac said, death is thought to be what the Sabbath is a type of, right? So the Sabbath is a type of death. It's the idea of resting shows us that we work, we go into rest, and then we rise, right? And so Christians themselves, in their worship, they gather for the celebration of the Eucharist, the Eucharistic meal, and the celebration of the resurrection of Christ on the 8th day, meaning Sunday, right? Sunday is the 8th day, symbolic of resurrection. In fact, you'll even notice this in ancient Christian architecture, where you have a number of buildings. Often these were, regarded as martyria, or a martyrium, which is just a place, that usually was built over some event of a saint, or some life testimony of something directed toward the Christian faith. Usually it had to do with the saints and commemoration of the saints, but they would be in the shape of an octagon. And you can see, from the images here of different churches, some destroyed, some still active, that these shapes, these 8-sided octagons, sometimes you may only see it in the interior of a church where the dome itself is shaped as an octagon. That 8-sided shape is reminiscent of resurrection. Sometimes a baptismal font will be shaped in 8 sides in an octagon, because it's about the 8th day. It's reminiscent of the resurrection and what it means to partake in the Christian life. So the Sabbath then, and the 8th day, the Sabbath being the 7th, and the 8th day being the Lord's Day, is a transformation of death. And that's really the way it's thought of in Christianity. Here we can see the Lord of the Sabbath refers to not only this idea of being the master of time, but the one who, between the Friday of the crucifixion and Sunday of the resurrection, descended to Sheol, that is to say the pit, liberated the captives. And we refer to this day as Bright Saturday, or Saturday of Lights, when this descent into the pit of death, really occurs. And if you know Christian narrative, this is sort of the centerpiece of salvation history, right? The death, descent into Sheol or Hades, maybe you've heard. Sheol is the Eastern term for it. And then the resurrection following on Sunday. Again, according to Mar Isaac, time itself is contextualized by the salvific work of Jesus. So the Sabbath of Exodus and Deuteronomy came as a type for our own approach to life, death, and the general resurrection of the dead and the new life of the world to come. Now, what does that mean effectively for Sabbath observance? Well, we should not think of the Sabbath command of the Old Testament as a directive to just work 6 days, but pray and rest on the seventh, right? The idea of setting it aside for prayer alone is not necessarily the way it's received in the Christian tradition. Christians are called to pray without ceasing, not necessarily to confine it to a day or have one day where the whole day should be filled with prayer exclusively, but that every day at all times, a Christian should be engaged in prayer. That means everything you do, everything that from the mundane to the specifically holy, right? The things that, you don't have to be at church. You can be in your role as a parent, in your role in your career, or as a child, someone who lives in a family and addresses their parents in a certain way. Everything that we do should be a type of prayer. It should be an act of that conversation, which the saints refer to prayer as a type of discourse or intercourse between God and God and man, or the divine and humans, right? Where we are engaged in a communicative process. And so life itself and every action of life has to be regarded as prayer. We do, however, gather on the Lord's Day. And in fact, there's some traditions like in Ethiopia where there will be Sabbath observance in addition to gathering on the Lord's Day, or the 8th day, or the new day, as it's called. So celebration of the Sabbath, then, in the minds of some of the fathers, is to celebrate the Sabbath is to hope to receive from God this very thing of not committing sin. From Augustine, again, but the rite of the Sabbath was taught to our ancient fathers, which we Christians observe spiritually, so that we abstain from all servile work, that is, from all sin. For the Lord says, everyone who commits a sin is a slave of sin. And we have rest in our hearts, that is, spiritual tranquility. Now, from St. Ephrem the Syrian, we read, indeed, it is not because he rested on that day that God does not weary, blessed and sanctified the 7th day, nor was it so that he might grant that people who did not set aside a day when they were freed from their servitude to give rest to their servants and maidservants. He gave it to them so that even if they had to be coerced, they would rest. For it was given to them in order to depict by a temporal rest, which he gave to a temporal people, the mystery of the true rest, which will be given to the eternal people in the eternal world. Also, because a full week was required, God exalted with a word that 7th day, which his works did not exalt, so that because of the honor set apart for it, it might be united to its companions, and so that the numbering of the week, which is required for the service of the world, might be completed. So, from the fathers, you see this idea that the engagement in the Sabbath is effectively a freedom and a rest from imperfection, right? The idea is indeed a call to the transformative life, to a life without imperfection or sin. Sometimes we think of sin as something a little more naughty, right? You'll hear people refer to somebody as a sinner or whatever, but and you think, oh, that person's naughty, they're bad. But sin just means imperfection. It means engaging in the non-divine life, or the life which is not God. And if someone is a partaker in the divine nature, they're continually moving toward a sin-free life, right? And so being able to enter our Sabbath, our death, in this way, we have hope for the resurrection on the 8th day. And that's effectively the way in which this idea was conceived in the early church. And of course, today, there's different people have different perspectives, of course, whether it's, in certain communities of Judaism on the one hand, or, different Protestant denominations on the other. There's really a range of how people approach this topic, how people approach the Sabbath itself. As for the early Christians or the Eastern Christians or the Orthodox Christians, however we want to phrase it, there's this idea that the Sabbath itself marks resting, right? But what does resting mean, right? It means resting from sin, and it means preparation for the life eternal. So thanks for the question. I hope it provided some perspective and answer to how Eastern Christians view the topic. If you have your questions for me, as always, you can email me at professorwingert@gmail.com. You can leave a comment below. And now I will rest from this video. I'm going to take my Sabbath. How about that?